Appreciate everybody joining us today. My name is Will. I'm the host of the Better Fantasy Football Show, joined today by Andrew Cooper at Coop Fiasco on Twitter. He's the lead analyst for Fantasy Alarm, easily one of the most reputable sites in our space. He's also a regular guest appear on SiriusXM and the Better Sports Network. Coop, this is a huge deal for our podcast to have you on, man, so really appreciate it.
Hey, dude. Once I met you at the FSGA, I knew you were doing big things out here. So when you reached out, I was like, hey, birthday weekend is on hold for at least one more hour, and then it's party time, right? So let's go.
Appreciate it, man. Well, let's jump right into it. So the reason that I am so excited to have you on is because you are legitimately, I will say, the foremost authority when it comes to evaluating the tight end position for fantasy sports. So I know that's a big thing to say, and I know you're a humble guy, so you won't admit it. But I want the audience to sort of learn more about why that's the case. Like, what's your process for evaluating? How do you sort of view the tight end position in fantasy, both in redraft and dynasty? Could we just jump into that for a couple minutes?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have different takes for redraft, best ball, dynasty. And I think that's what separates the content that I put out and the work that I put in, is that I try my best to educate my followers and the Fantasy Alarm members on how to become better at this, rather than just give them rankings and say, here you go. You know what I mean? Like the cliche of the teach a man to fish versus give him a fish. So that's what I do. So whichever one you want to get into, I'll give you the process and hopefully help some people out there.
I love it. So let's talk dynasty first, just because that's sort of the context that we're all in right now. So what's your framework and what's your evaluation process look like for dynasty?
Yeah. So overall, before like even getting into rookies, the concept that I use, the most simple one because the hardest thing with your roster is figuring out like what direction you need to go in, what you need to do. The system I use is called SORT, S-O-R-T. That stands for start. It's a start opportunity, roster talent. Now the roster talent part would come first, but that's not a word. So I had to kind of swap it around a little bit, right? But so what you do is you want to draft as many talented players that you believe in as possible. But this is a very unique position, right? The reason that rookies don't break out often is, people, there's kind of a myth that it's all based on development. And obviously there is some development to it, but the reality is you need the opportunity to have the upside. Oftentimes when a tight end gets drafted, there's already an incumbent tight end on the team that can catch passes, right? Even if the tight end that's being drafted is the future. Think about Cole Kmet. Him and Jimmy Graham are in the same room. Jimmy Graham does not block. So no matter what Cole Kmet's role is going to be, it's not going to be the pass catching role. He has to wait for that, right? And then after that, he needs to become a top 2 target on the team. So it's very rare that you have such a ghost ship team that you're going to have a team where they don't have a pass catching tight end and they also don't have wide receivers. Usually they have one or the other, right? Like you have a Travis Kelce team that doesn't have really a bunch of wide receivers, or you have a Bengals with 3 good wide receivers. It's very hard to find that situation. So there's only been a handful of rookie tight ends that have popped off, like Mike Ditka, Jeremy Shockey, Evan Ingram needed the Odell Beckham injury to get there. And then Kyle Pitts at 1,000 yards, obviously. So that's why it's so difficult. So what you really want to do is go out and get as many talented guys and wait for that window to open. If you're competing now, you need to just go out and get guys that can score now, that have the window open. I've seen guys loaded up with rosters of like long-term stashes lose to guys in the championship that were playing Logan Thomas because they just embraced that, right? So that's my dynasty philosophy overall. As far as rookies go, very difficult position to evaluate, and it's probably easier if we kind of go through this year's rookies and I'll tell you what we're looking for.
I love it, man. So let's start it out. So what we're going to do today with Andrew is we're going to do a tiered ranking, because anybody who's listened to our show knows that that's the only way to do rankings at this point, is because, especially when we're doing our rookie drafts, right, Coop? Because if you have 2 guys in the same tier, and this is a spiel I give at the top of every show, if you have 2 guys in the same tier, why would you give up more draft capital to go get one versus the other? It just makes no sense. So really appreciate you tearing this up for us.
And I think a lot of real life teams embrace that philosophy as well. Where they'll tier everybody and say, okay, these guys are generational talents, and then these guys are serviceable pros. And that's why you see teams drafting guys that might not be a fit right now, because they're saying, okay, we have 14 guys on the board that we think are the top tier. We're going to take whoever's there out of one of them. If it's Bijan Robinson or whoever, it doesn't matter if you already have that position filled, right? So we have to do the same thing in Dynasty. Tier them up and say, okay, I'll take all these wide receivers, all these running backs. Then I'll take my top tier tight end, and then we go back to wide receivers and running backs before we come back. So I'm willing to tier them up for you, Will, because I think that's kind of how we have to operate.
I love it, man. Okay, so let's start with tier 5.
Yes. So these are we're working our way to the best players, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. So tier 5 for me are just guys that I'm not touching at all. Typically, and these are guys that don't have the draft capital either, because they're guys that I don't like the profile of that go early, and you kind of still at a certain point have to take a shot on those guys. That's not these guys. The only time I will put early drafted guys in this tier is if they're very clearly just blocking tight ends. Like Drew Sample in the second round, I looked at that and I was like, I know what this guy is going to do, right? Like he's a bruiser. So, but for the most part, you're looking at guys that are, just late round and they don't really have that upside. So I look at guys like Payne Durham, like he goes to the Buccaneers where they have Cade Otton, and this guy ran a 4.87 40, right? Like, that is Jack Doyle level slow, where, Doyle had brief opportunities where he got a ton of targets. But if you look at his speed and how that affects his average depth of target and his yak, there were years that he had the same number of targets as Rob Gronkowski, and very different seasons. If ever anybody, I don't even think I need to explain how different those players were, right? So guys like Braden Willis to San Francisco. Braden Willis wasn't even the best tight end drafted by the 49ers this season, right? And both of them are competing with George Kittle, so it's kind of rough there. But I will add, the 49ers did have, in my opinion, the single best 2 tight end draft in one season of all time. Do you remember who it was? It's tough one. It's tough one.
I'm gonna pass.
They took Vernon Davis in the first round. Wow. And then they came back in the 6th round and took Delaney Walker.
Wow.
Which, it's like Hayden Hurst, Mark Andrews is up there for the Ravens, and obviously the Patriots with Gronk and Hernandez, but Hernandez kind of disqualified himself there. So that to me, the single best single team tight end draft. But so Braden Willis is there, Payne Durham I'd put there. I put Davis Allen in there as well. Just another one where painfully, brutally slow, right? Like 4.84 40. You need to have that, unless you're going to get absolutely peppered with targets like Zach Ertz did. You need to have that speed because it translates to yak, it translates to ADOT. If you really think about Zach Ertz, think about how many targets that guy got. He has one season with 1,000 yards. He needed 150 targets to get there. He didn't have 1,000-yard season until he was 28 years old. That's what happens when you don't have that speed, right? So it kind of rules out a bunch of those guys for me, unless I look at him and I say, this is Zach Ertz. And with these guys, I just don't, So that's kind of the bottom tier for me of the guys who actually got drafted.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And look, these guys are probably players that are going to end up on special teams, and some of them might carve out a nice, decent NFL career as a special teams player, but odds are they're not going to be fantasy relevant. So I appreciate the fact that you're kind of, making that known.
Yeah, and I could see Davis Allen be maybe even like a Donald Parham type. He's very tall and he does have a red zone presence. Like Parham, they'll chuck it up to him every once in a while, but they primarily use him as a blocking tight end. So just not super interested in grabbing those guys. Those are guys that if you just put them on the watch list, I guess, and if they ever do anything, maybe add them, but I'm not using their roster spot.
Okay, yeah, good to know. Okay, so that's tier 5, tier 4. Who do we have here?
Yeah, so tier 4 for me is and this is where you have to kind of look at your league and your depth and figure out what kind of a person you want to be. Tier 4 and 3 are almost interchangeable for me. So tier 4 to me are the guys that went very late day 3, but are just high upside athleticism. And tier 3 are the guys that went in rounds 2 and 3 and could profile as pass catchers, but I'm not super excited about the profile, right? So if you wanted, you could skip right to this tier, in my opinion, right? So here we're talking about there's really only a handful of guys that go in this tier for me. One would be, to give you an example, Zach Kuntz went to New York Jets. Very late draft pick, but this guy had a 10 of 10 RAS score, right? Like he legitimately one of the best all time, according to that particular formula. In my opinion, Vernon Davis is the best combine of all time, but it's hard to argue with the athleticism for this guy. So he's a guy, even as a 7th round pick, I just say, hey, I'm just going to bet on these guys. This tier, like if you have a taxi squad, I actually probably move this group ahead, and I say I'll throw him right in there. Another one, this is the special taxi squad guy because there's no position requirements for taxi squads in most cases. Elijah Higgins is a wide receiver from Stanford, but all combine, he was saying, the teams have asked me to play tight end. I've been watching Evan Ingram, who I love, that. So he got drafted by the Dolphins, and he could end up in like that Mike Gesicki type big slot role where he could be like, if they do change him to tight end, as has been rumored, his best comp would be another player who was a wide receiver converted to tight end, Juwan Johnson. Very similar size, 40 time. He's maybe a little slower Chigakonkwo type guy. So those are the guys where he fell in the draft. If this guy went early in the draft to a team that planned to use him as tight end, this guy could have been ranked for me as high as, like, I'm not even kidding, 3 or 4. Wow. Because if you take his like measurables on like Player Profiler and change him to tight end, now he's being compared to like really good tight ends. When you compare him to wide receivers, though, you're like, not really, right? So those are the kind of guys in that tier. I would also throw, to be honest, Darnell Washington, because of the situation.
Yep.
He kind of got hamstrung into being a pass blocking tight end, like a blocking tight end, but the athleticism's there, the crazy athleticism. But I'm just so worried. Like, he calls himself a 6th lineman. I don't like that. We want to. Yeah, it scares me. And I guess I would also put Cameron Latu in there from Alabama. Just on tape, he looked good. It's so hard to judge Alabama guys because, there's so much talent on those teams. So on one hand, you say, oh, well, there was a lot of competition for targets. On the other hand, you look at the highlights and you're like, oh, well, they're covering all these other players. He's running free most of the time. So you don't really get to see him go one-on-one or really like break tackles because you don't have to in Alabama, right? So It's kind of tough to judge a guy like that. But in that group, I'm like, sure, why not? He's the one that went to the 49ers that I like better than, like, if I'm going to pick one of these two guys, Braden Willis or Cam, I'm going to take Cam.
Okay. Anybody else on tier 4, Coop? Or
I think that's it for tier 4 for like, again, if we're looking for there's a couple guys that are at the top of tier 3. If we're trying to go linear, that I think are athletic and win a little later. So I think I'll just talk about those guys right now, right? Cool. Kind of. So Will Mallory, who went to the Colts from Miami. That's a guy who has the speed, right? He ran the fastest 40 time of any tight end in this. Again, if Elijah Higgins were a tight end, he would have the fastest 40 time, but he's not. So Will Mallory had the fastest 40 time, and he fights for the extra yards. That's the thing with these players. Because I personally, anyone familiar with my work knows that I prefer statistics, I prefer metrics, I prefer narratives. But with rookies, you have to watch film because you don't always have that, right? You don't have. It's so hard to compare a guy that's playing like Hawaii or a guy that went to Old Dominion like Zach Kuntz to somebody that like Latu that played SEC, like Alabama schedules. Those games are ridiculous. So you got to kind of watch. And what I look for is I look for guys that are winning in one-on-one, man-to-man, making contested catches, making guys miss. I also look for awareness. That's one of the big things. When you watch George Kittle's college highlights, and I'm not claiming that I knew George Kittle was going to be awesome because he was a 5th round pick, and the 49ers only took him because they took CJ Beathard in the 3rd, and they were just like, let's just take his college roommate too later. They didn't even know. But when you go back and watch the highlights, this guy has crazy awareness and ability to, he's diving from like the 4-yard line to score touchdowns. He's finding like small creases and windows to get open. And I see a bit of that from Will Mallory, where there's something to be said for a guy where there are 4 defenders around him and there's nowhere to go, but he finds that pocket to get 3 more yards, right? Versus the guy who just goes right down. So there's something he's got that football IQ almost, where you see some people get the ball and, like Max Williams, the tight end for the Cardinals, like when he gets the ball, he looks like he he looks like a guard that just like found a fumble, like it's not quite. Will Mallory looks like he looks like he knows what he's doing, and then the other guy I would put in that group of like we're chasing athleticism is just Josh Wiley. He went to the Tennessee Titans, unfortunately, and I love Chig Okonkwo.
Yeah.
But you can't rule it out, right? Like you never know. Hayden Hurst was drafted ahead of Mark Andrews, and we think Chig's the guy, but sometimes you put two guys in the room together, and one of them is just much better, and you don't know that until it happens. So I'm taking shots on him sometimes too.
Okay, I love it. So that's sort of like the 3.5 tier, would you say?
Those are, what I would call that? Those are the guys I'm actually drafting at ADP. So I basically look at it and I'm taking those stabs at ADP, and I'll go through and I'll tell you who I am and who I'm not, even if I have to rank them at a certain point because the odds of success are good. There's a difference between, having better odds and being worth where they're being drafted to me.
Right.
So
100%.
We'll get into those guys now.
Cool. Let's do it.
Yeah. So for me, I look at some of these other guys, and this is kind of the tier 3 where I'm not quite taking them at ADP. If they do slide, I will take a couple of them. So one that I will take if he slides, and I actually have this guy, if I was going to do linear rankings, he's ranked like 4 for me, is Luke Musgrave, right? So the problem with Musgrave is that we know he's a very athletic guy because you look at his background, and I talked to Brandon Huffman of 247. He's a pretty famous high school to college scout. Like he's deep in this stuff.
Yeah.
Very legit. He was the one that told me way before the draft. He came, we had him on the show, and I asked him about Darnell Washington. He was like, when this guy was 17, 18 years old, scouts were going to him and saying, your meal ticket is to switch to offensive tackle. And they were saying, here are your 2 options. Switch to offensive tackle and play in the NFL, or stay at tight end and you might be working at a car wash. And Darnell Washington said, I'm a tight end. He's like, I'm not doing that. And it worked out for him. I mean, he did get drafted, but we're talking about a guy that at his size, 6'7", 270 or so, like he could put on 20, 30 pounds and be offensive tackle tomorrow. I mean, I've seen clips. If you look up, there's a guy, George Fant that plays, he plays for the Jets, or he did last year before they played for the Seahawks. If you look up George Fant, Northern Kentucky highlights, you know what comes up? Basketball or Western Kentucky. Yeah, he was like a forward, and then they convert him to tight end, and then now he plays offensive tackle. It can happen like that. And when you watch those basketball highlights, you're like, how is this guy that guy, right?
Yeah.
But that's how it goes sometimes. So you worry about that. With Musgrave, he's got all that behind the scenes. They talk about how he is like a competitive level skier, right? Like he's an athlete, everything. The problem is we didn't get to see it because he got hurt his senior year. Before that, he only played sporadically. This guy, when you look at the numbers, no numbers guy is going to like Luke Musgrave. He only had 2 broken tackles in all of his entire, the entire time in college. 2 broken tackles. That's it. He never really had the big season. But he gets drafted to a team that has an ambiguous setup in terms of targets where he could play a good amount of slot. So he's interesting, right? So like Luke Musgrave is a guy, I have to rank him there, but he just goes a little too high in rookie drafts for me. So I don't have much of him. I did draft him in one spot where nobody was taking him, and I was like, you know what? I will take him.
Time. Yeah.
It's the tier situation where I got through my whole third tier of RBs and wide receivers. And even was looking at tier 4 for a guy that I liked enough, and I just didn't have it. So I took Luke Musgrave.
Yeah, there you go. Easy peasy. Yeah. No need to think too much about it.
And it's like, if you treat it that way, then you feel better about picking guys that you didn't necessarily want, because you're not always going to be right. So sometimes you do want to take the value at a certain point, right?
Yeah.
Like
100%.
Even the people that hate Jonathan Mingo for whatever reason, they're all over Twitter. At a certain point, you look around and there's no other wide receivers from day 1 and 2. That you don't skip Jonathan Mingo and take a day 3 guy, right? Like, right. And I've seen people do it. It's a mistake.
Yep. 100. So you think with Musgrave, the opportunity part in your sort analysis is there, sort of the at least the potential for the opportunity to be there.
Right. I just wrote an article called "The Art of the Wide Receiver Dart Throw," right? And this is more geared towards best ball. But basically, what you want to do oftentimes is look for the most uncertainty, the most change. Early in drafts, certainty is your friend, right? Like
Yep.
Justin Jefferson, the odds of him being good are high, right? Like where'd you put him without factoring injury in? We're talking 99%, right? Like yeah, you have to. I'll never give anything 100%, but 99 is probably pretty right. So you want certainty early. Later on, we want uncertainty. We want new coach, new coordinators, new QB, all sorts of different weapons in there, right? That's how you say, hey, you know what, we don't know what's going to happen, so let's lean into it, right? So with Luke Musgrave going to this team, new quarterback, new OC, you got Christian Watson, Romeo Dubs. They drafted Jerron Reed. It's like we don't know who's going to be the guy, right? Mm-hmm. So I like that situation. Now the interesting part about the setup I have is that directly after him, I have Tucker Kraft, the other tight end drafted by the Packers, because we don't know. It's a situation where Luke Musgrave is the low floor, high upside pick by them, and Tucker Kraft is kind of the safe pick. Well, the Ravens did that too. In the first round, they took Hayden Hurst, who was a guy that went to play minor league baseball. And you know what I mean? He was a crazy athlete, went to play minor league baseball, got the yips, came back to play football, and was kind of a mystery box. They took him, and then 2 rounds later, they took another guy that they probably felt was a little safer, and his name was Mark Andrews. Yeah. Right? So I am not one that says you have to pick one or the other. I'm one that says, why not? Why not with this guy? So, I'm honestly more inclined to take Tucker Kraft later at his ADP than I am to take Luke Musgrave at his. But both those guys, with the opportunity there, are in that group, right?
Gotcha. I love it. Anybody else in tier 3 there for you?
So tier 3, the rest of tier 3 are guys that I think have a good opportunity, and they got good draft capital, which means that mathematically the odds are there for them to become career NFL players, because a lot of these guys aren't even going to be NFL players, to be honest. Right. That's just the way it goes, right? So one guy, Luke Schoonmaker for the Cowboys, he's got to go in the tier, right? You can't exclude him from the tier. I just personally, and I will give him this benefit of the doubt, that the Michigan offense did not set him up for the way they ran a lot of RPOs, a lot of play action. They did a good job of getting him in space, but they didn't really set him up to show what he can do, if he can really. Because you go, it's not that hard to watch every highlight for a tight end, because it's like 47 catches, some of these guys, right? So I watched every catch the guy had, and it's just there's not a lot of man-to-man, not a lot of contested catches. The things I liked about Will Mallory, you just don't see it. You see him, he had one really good catch against Iowa, and a lot of not much. He only like Luke Musgrave, he only broke 2 tackles total in all of college. So he's a guy where I'm just like, he just feels like just a guy. You know what I mean? Which in that offense, Dalton Schultz is kind of just a guy, and he looked pretty good too. So you have to.
How do you feel about Ferguson, real quick? Sorry.
So when I broke down those two, dude, you're here to ask me questions, man. Never say sorry. Yeah. Jump in, and I'm very long-winded, so definitely.
You were on a roll. You were on a roll.
I definitely jump in and say shut up, though. Yeah.
No, if we think about the sort philosophy and sort of methodology, Ferguson is somebody who some people are interested in, right? And so if he's nice, then the opportunity is not going to be there for Schoonmaker. So how do you feel about Ferguson?
Here's the question we run into with that is that, so I broke down Ferguson and Peyton Hendershot, and I included the games where both with and without Dalton Schultz. And in the games without Dalton Schultz, Peyton Hendershot actually played, even though he played less overall snaps, he ran more routes and he played more snaps from the slot. They basically turned it into a bit of a committee type thing where Peyton Hendershot played in the slot and Ferguson was the inline guy. Now, sometimes what happens when a guy like Schultz leaves is Ferguson just gets the full-time job and he's a full-time tight end. Sometimes what happens is you have this inline tight end and then you have this guy playing the slot, like a Jonnu Smith, Anthony Ferkser thing, or an OJ Howard with Cameron Brate thing. And what ends up happening is neither of them play enough to be good, right? The Cameron Brate and the Ferkser, they steal just a little bit too much of that work for the other guy to be relevant. So when I look at that whole situation and the fact that Brandon Cooks is there now, I think if any of those guys is going to eventually is going to become the guy, that window probably is not going to open until the team is willing to sit here and say, this guy's a focal point of our offense now, so we don't need Brandon Cooks anymore. We don't need Michael Gallup anymore. Or so that's my concern there with the situation, is that CeeDee Lamb is the number one, so everybody else is kind of fighting to be number two. And like, if you ask me who's a better pass catcher, Brandon Cooks or Jake Ferguson, I don't think we'd have to have a very long debate on that.
Yeah.
Right.
And so for Schoonmaker, he's just kind of fodder there at the back end of the totem pole.
Right, for me, yeah. So ideally, again, like if you have deep benches and taxi squads and stuff, you can throw him on there and kind of see what happens. But there's not enough that I saw. Doesn't have as enough speed, right? Like I have to look for. You got to give me something, right? Like when I look at the film, I have to see something pop. Or when I look at your player profile or your RAS scores, I need to see 90th percentile speed, or I need to see something, because the reality is there's been very few drafts where there's even 3 fantasy relevant tight ends.
Mm-hmm.
You had there's some great 2 tight end drafts like Jimmy Graham and Gronk same year. Mm-hmm. That's pretty good, right? But like there's essentially been one that had multiple fantasy relevant tight ends, and that was the year with Mark Andrews and Gesicki and Schultz, and there was actually a 4th guy in there, so making it a really maybe the best fantasy tight end draft of all time. But the odds are there's going to be 2, maybe 3 from this class. If there's 4, then it'll be one of the best of all time. Yeah. So Schoonmaker, I'm sitting here, I'm like, if I'm counting 2 and 3, I can't put him in 2 or 3. I don't think you put him in 6 or 7. So he falls in that group. And it's easy for me personally. Brenton Strange also falls into a very similar group, where like if I had to pick a guy to be the Drew Sample of this group, where a team drafted him to be a really good blocking tight end and replace Michael Pruitt, that's Brenton Strange. Like he goes to the Jaguars, where they have a tight end right now, at least, that in Evan Ingram. He'll probably be gone next year, that plays slot. They have 3 good wide receivers. I just think he's going to be an inline tight end. So not super interested in Mr. Strange either. And that kind of rounds out that whole group, honestly. Like I think that covers, there were only 16 tight ends drafted, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of covers that. The crazy thing about the tight end is that some of these tight end position, I go back and look at some of these drafts and we're like, who's the best tight end that was drafted? In a number of them, of them was no one. And in some of them, the best tight end drafted wasn't a tight end. Like I think 2015, the best tight end drafted was wide receiver Darren Waller, who, you know what I mean? Yeah. He washed out as a wide receiver, came back as tight end. The year before that, back-to-back years, the year before that, the best tight end drafted was a quarterback. It was Logan Thomas. He was quarterback. So it's like the best tight end of this class might be some D3 quarterback. We don't even know his name yet. That's fantasy football. That's tight end, right?
So before we get into tier 2, Coop, I just kind of want to get your perspective and sort of framework for thinking about these guys in tier 3 specifically, like in rookie drafts. Like, are these guys that you're sort of just not even thinking about in a rookie draft? Like, would you trade away this potential like fourth round pick, let's just say, for like a player that you think can actually fill a role for like 1 year, like maybe like Cordero Patterson or something like that? Like, are you taking the stabs on these guys still?
So I think of it in terms of the end of my bench. That's what you always need to think about, right? The very last person on your bench is going, if you're any good at this, in my opinion, I always look at it and say, the very last person on my bench is going to be dropped potentially before the season even starts, but probably week 1, because I want to be in on the first few waivers, right? So if I don't have a taxi squad, then I look at it and I say, am I going to put somebody, even like Will Mallory or Josh Wiley, who I like, on my bench and stash them there? Because like Josh Wiley, how long are you going to have to stash Wiley? Because you have to, I'd be shocked if week 1 he was just like getting 6 targets, right? So I like to use that last spot on what I call a scratch ticket. A lottery ticket is somebody you believe in and you're willing to stash for long term, right? You buy the lottery ticket and you have to wait for them to call the numbers. When you buy a scratch ticket, you scratch that immediately and you find out what's going on. So in Superflex drafts, I'll give you an example. A guy I've been taking with my last spot is Clayton Tune, the quarterback for the Cardinals. And I don't even think he's good, right? But here's what I do know is that the quarterback, Kyler Murray, is not going to be ready to play. So Clayton Tune is either going to win that backup job and start for the team week 1, or I'm going to drop him to waivers. So I love a player like that where we're going to get our answers right away, right? So same with like honestly Tucker Kraft or Luke Musgrave. One of those guys when I love the first weekend when all the stats come out right after. Obviously, I love watching football. I'm not going to be that nerdy and say the best part is the stats, but I do love the next morning when I pull it up and I, grab my coffee and I look and I say, okay, who ran the most routes for this team? And if it's Luke Musgrave or it's Tucker Kraft, I might actually be willing to drop the other one, So that's how I think about that last spot. And it changes who I pick. If I have a taxi squad, now I am taking Wiley and Mallory and Elijah Higgins, and I'm taking Zach Kuntz, and I'm putting him in there, and I'm just saying, I'll see you guys in a couple of years, right? Like that's what that's for. So yeah, a lot of these guys I'm not taking. I have 0 shares of Schumacher, Brenton Strange. I don't have any Darnell Washington. I don't have any Latu. I don't have anybody from tier 5. So like, it really depends on the format, but that's how I treat it, right? That's the easiest way to look at it. Look at the last spot on your bench. Do you want to use that for 2 years on a tight end, or so many guys we sit here and debate in our heads forever. Do I take this guy? Do I take that guy? And you're dropping that guy in 2 months, right?
Yep. No, that's a really smart way to look at it. And if anybody who is listening to this is new to Dynasty, I couldn't recommend any more. You go back and listen to that last 2 or 3 minutes that you just laid out, Coop, because that is the strategy of Dynasty is so different than redraft. And that's pretty similar to redraft also, actually, because you got to be ready to drop guys and pick the next guy up. But that is just such a sharp way to look at it. Like last year in my Dynasty League, I took Calvin Austin in the 5th round, I think, because I was really intrigued by him as a prospect. And obviously, like, he had a foot injury that sidelined him for the whole year for the Steelers. And now it's sort of like in no man's land because you want to see this through. But at the same time, it's like, okay, like now I could pick up somebody who might be a little bit more impactful sooner, or at least I'll find out sooner. Like I'm going to find out sooner if they're going to be fantasy relevant or not. And that's the key, is you have to find out soon.
Exactly. And the thing is, a lot of smart people like Calvin Austin. JJ liked him, like a lot of people did. I liked him too. But it's like you have to know your roster and definitely look out for, there are sharp people in your league that I get people all the time. They send me these trade offers and like, this guy just sent me 4 second-round picks for my pick had 2-1, like 4 seconds for 1 second. And I was like, well, send me your roster. And I look at it, I'm like, okay, so you're going to cut the bottom 4 dudes from your roster. Go look at your buddy's roster, and he's probably looking at it and saying, "Oh boy, I'm gonna have to cut Tyler Lockett." You know what I mean? Like I'm looking at him like you're gonna cut. I think Tyler Lockett was his. He had a couple players that were easily cuttable, but I'm like, you're gonna cut Tyler Lockett or Chris Godwin because like those are the guys that are actually on your bench, And he was like, "Oh my God, you're right." Like so, definitely look at that. Look at what you have to do and just realize that those roster spots are valuable. So sometimes a 2-for-1 trade, you have to say, I'm getting 1 plus the best player on waivers. And now that trade is actually better than what you thought it was, right?
100%. Well, we could do a full hour just on Dynasty
I know,
strategy.
yeah,
we'll save that for another time.
I'm in, man. I'm in.
I love it. So let's go to tier 2. If that's the end of tier 3 for you, right?
Tier 2, yeah, that's in tier 3, and tier 2 is a quick one because it's one player. It's one player.
Let's talk about him.
It's Michael Mayer, right? So, that the cat out of the bag on that. That the tier 1 for me is Dalton Kincaid and Sam Laporta, and tier 3 is Michael Mayer. And people get upset by that, but they have to recognize that I believe that he is one of, if not the best tight end in this class. He's the best 2-way tight end in this class, meaning that he can play in line and block. He can get up the seam. He can make great plays, right? We like that, but to be that guy and have high-end fantasy upside, you need to be a unicorn. There's only been 2 tight ends since I've been tracking it that have blocked on more than 15% of their pass plays and finished top 5 in fantasy. Those guys, can you try and guess? Just think best.
I'm going to say Gronk for 1.
Gronk is 1.
And then 2.
The other one's active.
Okay. I'll say Andrews.
Nope. So Andrews, oddly, he blocks on like 1% of his pass plays. They do
really?
Not. They would not have him do that. I think best blocking tight end that actually is also a really good fantasy tight end.
Hawkinson.
it's Hawkinson is actually, he got up to like 12% one season, but it was
Okay.
George Kittle.
There you go.
George Kittle. Yeah, he snuck in there like 16% one year. It was the, you know what it was? It was the year that he had 3 70-yard touchdowns. You
By
know,
the way, thank you
and
for putting me out of my misery there. I could have guessed all
I,
day.
I don't. Yeah, I feel like you would have got it. You would have got it with a couple more, but time is money.
Yeah.
So George Kittle, he had like 3 70-yard touchdowns. He runs a 4.52. People don't realize that that's 96th percentile speed. Like George Kittle is deceptively fast. He looks like such a goon. That's probably why they don't. The linebackers and stuff think like, oh, I got this guy, and then he's gone. So.
Farm boy from Iowa.
Right. Yeah. He can fly, dude.
Yep.
The Iowa tight end factory, really. So Michael Mayer, like, given the situation, he has to be that guy. Now, the other thing that puts him in this tier is the short-term opportunity, because in Dynasty, I hate to say it, but you have to recognize that opportunity creates immediate value, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know who the best wide receiver from last year's class will be career-wise. In 2010, the best wide receiver as a rookie was the Buccaneers' Mike Williams. And right? Like, and we all looked at it. He's like, wow, 10 touchdowns, 1,000 yards. Like, this is the guy. Turns out he was not the guy. And the other guys from that class were Dez Bryant, Antonio Brown, Emmanuel Sanders, Demaryius Thomas, and Golden Tate, and Eric Decker, and like 100 guys that were better. But he had the opportunity on a kind of a skeleton crew tanking Buccaneers team, right? So last year, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave got the best opportunity and a ton of targets, and they did really well. But we don't know if they're going to be the best. We don't know if Drake London or Christian Watson or Jameson Williams or any one of these guys. So you have to keep that in mind, that the short term, you're going to gain value if you have opportunity. Michael Mayer falls to a team that has Devontae Adams and 2 Hunter Renfrows now, or 2 Jacoby Myers now, whatever you want to call it. They're the same guy. So target hog players, right? Then they have Josh Jacobs, who also, collects a lot of targets. He had, a ton of targets in 2-minute drill situations, third most of any running back. So you look at that situation, and Michael, it's going to take time, So for me, that's why he's in a different tier. The profile, and if this guy went like 7th overall, like some people suggested he would, then I would have him higher. But the fact that he wasn't even the second tight end drafted, I got to move him down, man. So he didn't get the draft cap, he didn't get the landing spot, and he already didn't have the profile. So, I have to have him in a tier separate from the rest of these guys, because I do think he's a great NFL player. And if we're playing the game of who's going to actually be an NFL player for full time, for a long career, he's in the 2 or 3 guys, right? Mm-hmm. But I can't put him in the other group.
Gotcha. Where are you thinking about Mayer in terms of round? Is he like a mid-second round guy in rookie drafts?
So I can't get him, because I do think he is, but the problem is there's always the guy that there's always the preconceived notion guy in your draft, right? The guy that makes his rankings before the draft and he doesn't change them, right? Yeah. He's probably got a lot of Hakeem Butler on his rosters, right? Yeah. But that's a jab at my personal buddy. My buddy that does that. Like, he thinks he's a scout. I'm like, dude,
we'll
you should
clip
just play
this and send it to him.
Yeah, well, I absolutely will. I'm not going to name drop him, but he should play. I tell him all the time. I'm like, dude, you are a good scout. Like, you should play Devy. He has Amon-Ra St. Brown. You know what I mean? Like, he does get the day 3 guys that are good sometimes, but he pays out the nose for them because he had them ranked so high before we got the rest of the puzzle, So I don't know. I'm going to try and get him a campus to can league or something, but do you know the guy? That guy is in every league, right? And that guy
Sometimes
still thinks
that guy.
You can be, though. You can be, because that guy, you know what? That guy makes a lot of good decisions. But because that guy exists, that guy takes Mayer as tight end 2 off the board, right?
Like, back end of the first.
Exactly. And I just had a bunch of decisions where it was Laporta or him, and I take Laporta, right? And there were a lot of times that I was taking Laporta as a tight end 3, so I just didn't have the opportunity. So not that I wouldn't do it, but this is a guy, like, if you're thinking that he's going to be your starting tight end this year and you're going to compete, you're in for a world of hurt.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so that's tier 2. Last tier. These are 2 guys that are very interesting, obviously. Kincaid gets the draft capital, gets the great landing spot, and then Laporta, we like him as well as a prospect, and then also gets the draft capital and a pretty good landing spot too. So how do you kind of separate them in tier one, like if you're on the clock and you have the choice between the two, who are you going to take and why?
It's Kincaid. It's Kincaid. And when you look at the thing about Kincaid, and I love Laporte. Like I was all over him before the draft, like big tout. But when you look at Kincaid, he got the treatment that we wanted from Mayer, right? The rank, they had him at 1, right? The pre-draft rankings had him at 1 or 2, and a team came out and traded up for him to make him the slot guy in a prolific offense. I mean, like that's poetry, right?
Yeah.
Like that's it, right? And he looks like a wide receiver. He plays like a wide receiver. They're not going to pay him like 1, which is probably why they traded up to take him in the first, and they can slap that indentured servitude 5th-year option, right? And tag him if they want, like, you know what I mean? Like it's going to be a great contract wise. And if he is the guy we think he is, like we're talking, remember when Chan Gailey was the offensive coordinator for the Jets, and he also for the Bills. Chan Gailey loved using big slot. He was the offensive coordinator for the Dolphins when he was offensive coordinator for the Dolphins when Mike Gesicki was tight end 6. He was offensive coordinator for the Chiefs for a year, and and Tony Gonzalez led the league, or he was second in the entire league in routes run from the slot behind only Hines Ward, right? So Chan Gailey with the Jets used Eric Decker as a big slot, and he was a monster. And with the Bills, he used a guy, David Nelson, who nobody even really knows. He just was like, who's the biggest wide receiver on the team? This is what you're doing. And he had a pretty good season, right? So if they're going to use Dalton Kincaid like that as like a full-time guy, like it's him versus Gabe Davis to be the top 2 target on the team, this guy fits the very rare conditions. I'm usually the one pouring cold water on the tight end saying, there isn't one this year in best ball. There isn't one in redraft. This year there might be one. There might be 2. Dalton Kincaid fits that bill. So he's one for me for sure. And I think he should be going as high, even in single tight end non-premium leagues, as high as 7. But anywhere, like I'm not going to take him ahead of, I have, I'm not going to take him ahead of Bijan, obviously, or Gibbs. I'm not going to take him ahead of Jackson Smith-Njigba. I'm not going to take him ahead of Jordan Addison or honestly, I'll take any of the first round wide receivers first, just because of hit rates, right? Like mathematical hit rates. Even as a tight end guy, like I'm not going to try and go up against math, So I'm taking those guys first, but after those guys go crazy. Take Kincaid.
I love it. So what's the difference between him and Laporta then in terms of situation? Because I love how you just spelled it out. Like the Bills traded up to take him, and he has a clear role built for him as the big slot guy. Like how does Laporta fit into the Lions offense?
So Laporta is, to me, like I love Dr. Pepper, right? Dalton Kincaid is Dr. Pepper. So Laporta is Diet Dr. Pepper, right? Like if there's no Dr. It's still very good. Actually, and so good. Like I personally like Dr. Pepper so much that if you were giving me a list of options and it's like Coke or Sprite or whatever and Diet Dr. Pepper, but the Dr. Pepper's out, I would get the Diet Dr. Pepper over the rest of them, right? So give me Laporta. He does very similar things to Kincaid. And when we talk about, and I admit, and I said it on the show already, that I'm not a big film guy. But when you watch the film, when you watch Sam Laporta, man, like this guy looks like a wide receiver. I talked about Musgrave and Schumacher, how they broke 2 tackles total in their college career. Sam Laporta broke 20 in his last season in college. In the single season, he broke 20 tackles. This guy,
beast mode.
He leads the league in plays that make it happen, Will. So this is a guy that, he's a yak monster. He's got the speed that we're looking for. He looked great at the combine. All good things, right? If Dalton Kincaid didn't exist, we would be screaming from the rooftops that this wide receiver-esque guy got picked as the first tight end off the board in the 2nd round. But because Dalton Kincaid exists, we got to move him down. The other thing about opportunity-wise is that, the Jets don't have, the Lions, they don't have Josh Allen. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who operates out of the slot. When all is said and done, he'll be a slot player. I project Amon-Ra St. Brown's career to kind of go the route of Tyler Boyd, where right now he's in the Tyler Boyd 2019 phase where he's getting 148 targets. I think that when all is said and done, they'll have Jamison Williams as flanker, and they'll bring in another guy, Jamison Williams as flanker, as in the Jamar Chase role. They'll bring in a big split end to be the T. Higgins, and then he'll settle into the slot, which is still a good and valuable player. But if they
real quick, Coop, are you selling Amon-Ra? Then is that what you're saying?
I personally, yeah, at where he's
Okay.
being drafted, it's crazy high. I mean, like you
Yeah.
look at the targets he had like 150 targets, and he didn't crack 1,200 yards. Jalen Waddle, as a rookie, they both had 7-yard ADOTs. Jalen Waddle's role completely changed. He became a
Mhm.
true outside wide receiver, went to a 12-yard ADOT. Amon Ross still stayed at 6.9. Yeah, this is gonna get me in trouble, Will. Why did you do that?
Sound
Now,
bites.
now
Sound
we
bites,
have
man.
we had this whole great tight end set up, and now anyone listening is just gonna be like, did that dude just say fade Amon Ross St. Brown? What a jerk,
I
right?
mean,
Because
dude,
everyone loves him.
you could get the world for him right now in Dynasty. So like
That's
that's a legit take
that's
to
what I'm
have.
go back and look, man. Like if you I pull up my Jalen Waddle article. Type Andrew. If you type in Jalen Waddle, I think it still comes up just on Google News. It was a good one.
Nice.
But if you type
Nice.
Andrew Cooper, Jalen Waddle, pull that up. There's a comparison between prime Tyler Boyd, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jalen Waddle, and one of them looks way better on paper. So Jalen Waddle got fewer targets than he did as a rookie, a lot less than Amon-Ra did last year. Why did he have like 1,400 yards? And Amon-Ra St. Brown had like under 1,200. It's because he runs high A dot routes. He's fast and he's bigger and he just makes better. He's just more of a playmaker. So to me, that he's a sell, right? So, but that's not what this is about. This is about Sam Laporta. Yeah, Sam Laporta to me, I think, and when you talk about immediate value, as much as I hate to say it, Sam Laporta could be a pick and flip type player. Like I love the guy. I'm going to draft him and I'll probably hold on to him for way too long. But if they come out and Jameson Williams is suspended and they haven't added the split end yet, that we're the future split end we're talking about, uh, Sam Laporta could come out and be the top target on the team or top two, right? But in this hypothetical future offense that I'm envisioning with a split end and Jameson Williams at flanker and Amon-Ra at slot and Jahmyr Gibbs catching a million balls in the backfield, I'm just not. I worry that Laporta could end up as more of a Cameron Brate or somebody like that. Where Cameron Brate, say what you will about his fantasy relevancy, but he was tight end 7 one year, and he's been in the league for 10 years, and he went to Harvard. So you can't really talk trash about Cameron Brate, right? Like he's
Yeah.
having a pretty good life. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So, but in Sam Laporta could have a really good career. That's the thing about tight end is the second or third best tight end from this class might be Cameron Brate, which is okay, but we want Mark Andrews, right?
Right. Right. I love it, dude. Well, look, I know you got to get to your birthday weekend, Coop. I don't want to keep you any
Let's
longer
go.
than I have to.
You know what? It's early enough. We can hang for a bit. I'm down, but yeah, it is birthday weekend, baby. Oh yeah.
Could you just kind of quickly summarize this whole draft class for us? Like, how do you compartmentalize them as compared to previous draft classes? Like, just sort of give the people some parting thoughts that they can take with them.
This is the best. This is the deepest tight end draft class that I've seen in many years. If I were to bet on a draft class to have 3 or 4 guys become fantasy relevant, I'd say this one. The hard part is picking which ones, right? Like it could be Kincaid and Musgrave and Darnell Washington. Like it's that hard to play this game. We just have to give ourselves the best odds of succeeding. For me, Dalton Kincaid is a first round pick. Sam Laporta is a guy I'm taking in the early second, and in my rankings, technically I have him at 12.
Okay.
But I never picked at 12, so I didn't really have that opportunity. And so it's just one of those things. You don't get to make every rookie pick. You kind of have to pick your spots. Michael Mayer is a guy I'm drafting in towards the end of the second round. And then I will draft Luke Musgrave in the third and potentially Tucker Kraft towards the end. If we're in deeper leagues where you go into the fourth and fifth rounds and you have the taxi squads, that's where you take your shots on. Personally, I like, you got to go. I think you got to go Will Mallory and Josh Wiley before you go for the crazy upside plays. But I'm throwing Zach Kuntz and Elijah Higgins. If I'm in a 5-round draft, I'm throwing Elijah Higgins on a taxi squad because, if he becomes a tight end, we want the cheat codes, right? We want those. I hate it, but like Taysom Hill and Juwan Johnson, like look at Washington's depth chart right now. Only one of those players was a tight end in college. Logan Thomas was a QB. Cole Turner was a wide receiver. Amani Rogers was a wide receiver. They got another guy who was a QB. The only one of them that actually played tight end was John Bates, and he looks like a tight end, and that kind of stinks for fantasy. So, that I'm going for those guys. So that's how I would sum it up. And just for anybody out there that does play Devy, I do got a couple names. Everyone knows Brock Bowers. I think next year he could be a first round guy. And again, next year we could go back to normal where there's one fantasy relevant tight end and then there's nothing, right? So like he's a guy, and then there's another guy that you got to look out for that I do like. He's got a great name for football as well. Colston Loveland.
Yeah.
He's plays in Michigan. You familiar with the guy?
I'm familiar with the name. Yeah.
Colston Loveland. It's almost like a Colt McCoy type, like Colston Loveland. Good Southern boy. So keep an eye out for those guys moving forward. I do, it gets shook up. I don't think Brock Bowers is going to get shook out of being a top dog though. He looks good, right?
Yeah, awesome. He looks great. Everybody on Georgia looks great.
I know. Yeah, I know. They were saying that it was like going to their pro day because Brock Bowers was there.
Okay.
That they were like watching. They were like, it's like going to the car dealer. It's going to the Lamborghini dealership and looking at next year's model that you can't have.
Yep.
So
I love it.
He'll
Dude.
be
Well,
interesting.
Coop, this was awesome, man. Thank you so much. Tell everyone where they can find you. Fantasy Alarm, Better Sports Network, SiriusXM.
Yeah, so with that stuff, the easiest way, because like we try to make it as easy as possible. If you just follow me on Twitter at Coop A Fiasco, and if you prefer Reddit, follow me on Reddit, Coop There It Is. If you just hit that follow button on there, I post everything. So I'll retweet this. If I read an article, I share the article. It all is there. If you want to find all my old stuff, just Google Andrew Cooper Fantasy Alarm and go there. And if you really like my stuff, if you use promo code COOP right now on Fantasy Alarm, you get 6 months half off of a membership, which gets you basically through fantasy season, at least through your drafts and stuff. And you get 7-day free trial where you can look behind the paywall, join the Discord, do some best ball drafts with us, see if you want to be a member. So that's where you can find all my stuff right now. Sorry for the dropping the promo code, man, but
don't apologize. We love Fantasy Alarm. I love Fantasy Alarm. So anything that we can do to help people get in sort of that network is huge. So we'll put the promo code in the show description too for everyone.
Awesome, man. Yeah, appreciate that. It's
100%.
an easy one. Promo code COOP.
Yep, I love it. Happy birthday, brother. Can't wait to see you in Cleveland at FSGA. So until then, live it up this weekend, I guess.
Awesome, dude. I appreciate it, man.
Safe.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, let's link up on another show this summer. I got some better sports stuff coming up, so we'll get you on our side.
100%. Love it, man.
All right, buddy. Cheers.
Peace.